Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the Executive Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, which is housed here at CUNY and is generously funded by Shelby White. This is now our 10th anniversary year, which means we've funded over 40 fellows working on biographies, and about almost 20 of those books have actually been published. It's a terrific program, and in addition to funding these individual biographers, we also put on events like this. And I just want to mention the new class of fellows. Some of them are here tonight, and they're all working on a quite diverse group of people. Bruce Weber is doing EL Doctoral. Bruce, are you here? There's Bruce. Eleanor Randolph on Michael Bloomberg. There's Eleanor. Justin Gifford on Eldridge Cleaver. And Lindsay Whalen is doing a biography of the poet Mary Oliver. And she's on hardship duty, working the archives in Ohio as we speak. And finally, Mickey Kaufman is working on Henry Kissinger. But we're here to celebrate and explore a fantastic new book by James Atlas. And it's on sale here at the back of the room. And it's an unusual book. Jim is a biographer of two highly critically acclaimed biographies. But this is sort of also a memoir about his days in the archives, his days as a monk, sitting alone, writing, and surviving as a biographer. Usually the format here is I conduct a conversation with the author and try to get him to talk about the process of writing the book. So we're going to begin, and then afterwards, after about 30 or 40 minutes, we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. Okay, Jim. Can everyone hear? Yes.
Okay.
I want to begin on the question of biography versus memoir, because you're a biographer and now you've written a memoir. And in one of your footnotes, you have many footnotes, real footnotes at the bottom of the page. You say they're fake footnotes, yes. They're really sort of set-asides, by the way. And you say at one point in one of these footnotes, the memoirist feels liberating after a life spent in the fact-constricted prison of biography. So my question is, isn't memoir also fact-driven? And you started this memoir back in 2010, I think. So that's 7 years. It's been hard work.
It's been very hard work, but do I need this? Is this working?
Yes, you do need it. Is it working?
Okay. It was very important to me that the memoir be factually correct. I think that a lot of its, whatever fundamental strengths it may have, rely upon the sense that the writer can trust that you are really not making things up. And I'm not. I had extensive journals, and I wrote down everything people said, the ones who were alive. And so when I say fact constricted, I think I mean that in biography you have to tell this story, and you have to put in everything that is what has now been determined to be an important fact, such as where Saul Bellow lived in 1924. You can't make that up. You can't get that wrong. And even his birthday, which was either July 10th or June 10th for some long, complicated reason, you have to put all that in. But the memoirist can decide, I don't even feel like discussing his birthday or when it happened or where he lived. And I can go straight to the things that interest me the most. And as Dwight McDonald, who helped me with my first book, said, kick around the facts. Feel free to kick around the facts. That doesn't mean you kick them into the dirt and ignore them, but it was amazing that it wasn't easy, but I could write my book, my version of things.
Okay. So why is biography, and this seems to be one of the themes of this book, why is it so hard? Why is it so labor intensive? And you ask this question, and then you answer it a little flippantly by saying, sooner ask a dog why it chases after a tennis ball.
Is that flippant? I don't know. I just finished reading the most wonderful book today, Claire Tomlin's Memoir. And you know, Claire is one of the premier English biographers who's done Thomas Hardy and Dickens and Pepys. Oh, you can't hear me? Claire Tomlin, who's written Pepys and Hardy and Dickens, and is a master biographer, and she has a wonderful description right on the last page of her book of what it is to be a biographer. I think I can remember 3 of the 4 words. It's a long slog, it's old clothes, and loneliness, and some other trial. But anyway, that's what it's really about, and it's so hard to do because you're inundated with your material, for one thing. You have, yesterday morning I heard Blake Bailey, Roth's biographer, talking about the archive of Roth that he's going through. He said it was the size of roughly this room. He was in a room like it at the 92nd Street Y. I don't know if it's 5 million or 500,000 yards or whatever it is. It's a stupefying amount of papers, and he's looking at every one here. But our friend Edmund Morris, who's here, is going through 5 million copies of Edison's papers, right? Is that the right number? 5 million. So my job was easy compared to that. But I think it's that, and then you have to organize everything, and you have to put it in the right place, and you have to make it interesting, and you have to make sure you're keeping your story going. I mean, so many biographies just become, as we all know, bogged down in the material and the data, and they can't really find their way clear to telling a story. So to me, that's about the hardest part. Where's the story in this?
Right. So at one point, you early on in the book, you describe different biographers, and you say the obsessed biographer, for him, everything matters. You call one poor soul the fanatical biographer, whose books are feats of near madness. Alternatively, you quote Edmund White, the biographer of Jean Genet, saying, biography is the revenge of the little people on the big people. And then you quote Emerson, properly no history, only biography. Then you quote Virginia Woolf, the biographer does more to stimulate the imagination than any poet or novelist, save the very greatest. So my question is, you as a biographer, do you identify with all these descriptions? Are you a near-mad, obsessive, fanatical, and revengeful soul, or a poet seeking to stimulate the imagination?
I'm both of those, plus the little people. Well, we go through many phases in the writing of our books. It's as if you've established a relationship with your subject, and you imagine that that it's all one relationship, but it's many relationships. It's many relationships a day. It changes every moment, and so really, you're the big person, you're the little person, you're the disciplinarian, you're the person who forgives. All of these different selves arrive at your desk at different hours of the day and night. And so what you think of as a constant is in fact a moving target, really. And you know, I spent 11 years writing my biography of Saul Bellow, and I changed dramatically during that time, and he changed dramatically during that time. So as I've written,
They're both moving targets, huh?
yeah, but he's harder to hit, and so you're constantly revising your sense of who this person is, and you're constantly being surprised if you're doing it right. You're being brought up short by some behavior that doesn't fit into the character that you've invented, because we've said that it has to be accurate, it has to be factual, but it is still invented in some profound sense, and I think that's where the discipline comes in.
So I'm interested also where you talk in the book at some length about the whole process of the research, and you confess, though, at some point that even letters and diaries are sometimes suspect, that they're more dubious than expected, and that sometimes, you know, reporters, there are some reporters in this room, reporters generally are required to have two sources for every fact, right? But if that rule was imposed, you say, on a biographer, it'd make it impossible to write biography. So I'm interested, again, coming back to the letters and diaries. If we can't rely on quotation from letters and diaries, if they too are dubious, in the end, what are we left with as biographers?
Well, I'm tempted to say intuition, but that's probably a bad idea. So I think letters and journals are in fact safe havens, relatively speaking. I mean, the writer is reporting events. Now, when in correspondence, sometimes the writer writes 7 different letters about the same event and tells it 7 different ways, but that doesn't mean that the facts are invented. I think what you really have are you have a scattering of documents, like someone's, like, not in the case of Bellow, but a birth certificate, or you have an address. Bellow's new biographer spends several pages trying to figure out whether Bellow lived at 2702 Lemoyne, or 2704 Lemoyne, or 2706 Lemoyne, and he never nails it, because all the buildings have been torn down. Urban development is a disaster for a biographer. Yeah. But so you have that, and what else you have, I'm not being facetious here, is you begin to have, after a while, maybe after a few years, I don't know what the interval is, a sense, you do have an intuition. This is the case. This really happened. This is what he said. Now, how do you know this? It would be a flimsy footnote that would explain it. But there comes this moment when you begin to have confidence and you feel like you're actually getting it. You're getting
That's where
this person.
the biographer becomes the poet.
I think so. Like Richard Holmes is such a great example of that. With Shelley, he goes far afield in conjuring up these beautiful scenes that you finally feel did happen. And that's because he's what we would call a responsible biographer.
So this actually reminds me, I wrote a memoir myself some years ago of my childhood growing up in the Middle East. And I could partly do it because my mother had been a great correspondent, and she saved all the copies of her letters. And so at one point I shared with her a draft chapter about Saudi Arabia. And she took issue with some story that I was recounting there. And I said, but Mom, I'm quoting from your letters. And she says, well, it wasn't like that. And I suddenly realized I had to, interview her at more length and figure out, well, what did she left out of her letter account back to her mom? And what was the context? And she could, and it was sort of a mix of the two in terms of the truth, such as it was.
Yeah.
So it's hard. The letter can't be the final arbitrator of everything. Neither can human memory.
No, but I heard a fascinating presentation a few weeks ago by Philip Lopate, speaking of moms, who late in her life decided to tape record his mother's account of her own life, and it was absolutely riveting. These moms, they're the ones who you should go to they really have the story. And but what made it feel so authentic to me was her voice. I don't know if she forgot one or two things or invented here and there, but you got this sense of somebody really going through their own memories and ransacking them and coming up with a story that felt deeply plausible. So it can be done.
So turning to a different question, one of the great imponderables for a biographer is choosing his subject. And so you write about this at some length, saying that you were drawn to Delmore Schwartz sort of out of overt reasons rather than covert reasons. Can you explain the difference between overt and covert motivations?
This was a distinction that I made up that I found very useful, because the overt biographer, which I seem to be, is drawn to characters whose own lives very much reflect the circumstances of the biographer's life. And with Delmore, he fascinated me not only because he was such a great genius, but because also he was born the year my father was. He was part of the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish immigration at the turn of the century, and I was a poet, and I identified with his obsession with T.S. Eliot, and all of these factors entered into my seeing him as somebody I could write about in an overt way, and by telling his story, discover things about my own story, which I did. 3 years or so after that, I was asked by Roger Strauss, then at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, the publisher of Edmund Wilson, if I wanted to write his biography. And at first, I was tremendously excited by this. I had all of Wilson's 40-some books on my shelf, and I had read them. I'd read some of them several times. I knew his work, and it seemed like a way of telling the whole story of 20th century literature. So I said yes, and I signed the contract. And 5 years later, I still hadn't even gone up to Yale to look at the papers. I didn't have that sense of urgency and curiosity. I've got to get there and find out about this guy. Because the more I found out about him, the more unpleasant it got. I mean, I'm certainly no prude, but his obsession with his meaty penis and his girlfriend's cream cheese feet and all, I mean, his anatomical, what Ellman called the precise anatomical convolutions, really got to me after a while. And plus, he was anti-Semitic, and he was, I mean, after 5 years, I thought, I can't spend another minute with this person, and I haven't even spent 1 minute with him. So, I sometimes regret this. I really do. I mean, what a great subject. And I still revere Edmund Wilson, but I just was not the right person at the right time for that book. And so then I wandered around lost in the biographical wilderness for a few years, wondering what I would do. and Bellow hove into view, and he was perfect, at least at the beginning. And he's from Chicago, which is where I'm from, and our family's very feebly, tangentially connected in various ways. Bakeries sold by one uncle to somebody else's cousin, which I can't even remember who, but it was a gestalt. This was Bellows. And my mother used to see him on the subway going to Northwestern. And she told me very emphatically, I didn't think he was so cute, but all the other girls did. And also, the most important of all, he was the greatest writer in the English language. And to read Humboldt's Gift, which came out just when I started my own book, and was a book about Delmore, or to read Augie March or to read Herzog, was to become just elated by the idea that you could write a book about a world that, while interesting to me, did not seem very picturesque. So that's how I embarked on my Bellow adventure, which became a whole complex drama in itself, but it could not have been more overt unless I'd written my own memoir,
Right.
which I've now done.
So that brings up actually the issue of a biographer writing about a dead person versus writing about a live subject. And there are different issues and problems and hurdles to overcome in each case. But with Bellow, you at one point you recount going to an appointed interview with Bellow, and he looks at you and he says, "First the dentist, then the biographer. What a day."
I'm sorry, Kai. I say that. He doesn't. That's my line.
That's your line?
Yeah, it's a really good line.
Oh, and I attribute it to Bellow. So did he laugh?
In his own way, he wasn't a big laughing type of person, but yes, he chortled weakly, I guess. But this is a great mystery that you bring up here, because I never knew Delmore, I never met him, and I do feel, now that things are winding down a little bit in this biographical career of mine, that I got Delmore because I didn't know him, and that I was talk about being liberated, not from the facts, but from the actual person. Because, you know, as Sartre says, hell is other people, but if the other person isn't there, then you don't enter into this kind of complex and abrasive relationship that I did later with Bellow. And now, in certain ways, I feel like I captured him more vividly because he was there, right in front of me, year after year. I saw his behavior, things he said, things he did. But he was such a large figure and such a living figure that he got in the way at times. And I felt like I was ending up giving, like, this was my version. It's always your version. But in this case, it was the version of somebody who had a lot of complex feelings about his subject.
Right. Well, at one point, I think I get this quote right. Bellow accuses you, or turns to you and remarks, "Well, you make some of it up too," meaning you're a novelist part of the time. He's very contentious. He's very difficult to deal with.
He is, and I think what he's saying there is, I don't think it was true. I mean, I must have made up 3 or 4 things in 600 pages, but that was not my way of operating. So in that sense, it wasn't really fair to me. But what he was saying was, you can't, I can't get it right, and you can't get it right. And whatever you say, whatever you write, will be provisional in some way. It will not, it will just be what you think. So yes, he was very contentious that way.
So at another point, you describe the relationship. You say after one interview, "For the first time, it occurred to me that Bellow wouldn't just sit there and tell me everything I needed to know. We were engaged in what Janet Malcolm would describe as a transaction." And so I guess my question is Malcolm right about this dynamic, or does she exaggerate the deviousness of the aspiring biographer?
So Janet is, I have tremendous admiration for her. I think she's really brilliant, but she also likes a good fight. And so she writes about people who are living, also people who are dead, but she likes to wade into this and turn them into characters. And I think she feels that the transaction is, how much of her story can she extract from these people, and how much are they trying to protect themselves? And so there's this kind of gladiatorial element to it, in which she's, you know, she made that famous remark that, what is it, the writer is is a murderer, or is that Joan Didion?
Parasite.
The writer will sell anyone out. That is Joan Didion, actually. But the writer, Janet says, is the murderer. And so she's full of aggression. And most people are full of aggression that they hide. But she revels in it, and it turns into great dramatic stories for her. But yeah, I think, the more you begin to see yourself as a player in this game, the more you are self-aware and don't think that you're just compiling your notes and your story, the better off you are, because then you really do have control over it. And it's just like, it's like having control over your life. You just know more.
So you anticipated my next question, which was I was going to quote to you after another interview with the difficult Bello, he once again refused to sign a letter of permission. You were constantly asking him to sign letters of permission so that you could see, a collection of letters in an archive someplace. And he turns you down on this occasion, but you come away from it with a revelation. Oh, this is fun. Biography is a game. And you're having fun playing, and you sometimes lose and you sometimes win, but it's fun, actually. It's a game.
Because he was, these were legal papers having to do with one of his divorces, and they were, I really wanted to quote them, and I wanted to see them because he was lying about his income and came this close to ending up in jail for a few days in Chicago because despite his lawyer telling him not to do that. So I thought, well, I really need to have this. And I did. But what I needed more to have was liberation from the sense that I had to have this detail or that detail. Whatever I didn't have, I would do without. I would find something else interesting. And I did. But what was exciting to me about it was the comic element of this. The lawyer whose papers I wanted, who became a friend of mine, Marshall Hobb, he writes Bell, he says, "Oh, Sandra has exploded her bomb again." And you just see the two of them fighting over, someone said their divorce was their marriage, that the 11 years it took them to get divorced, and this was their real bond. So once I realized that I could tell this story on my own, that there's nothing you have to have.
That it was liberating.
Yeah. It was all liberated.
At the end of the book, when you're dealing with your encounters with Bello and you publish the book, and you seem to be very hard on yourself for not being empathetic enough with Bello. And yet the real issue, it's clear, is that your portrait of Bello had to contend with the fact that in his novels, many of his characters were based on people in his life. So he was using friends and characters around him for novelistic purposes. And it was kind of mean-spirited at times, and you're hard on yourself for not being empathetic enough, and yet you had to deal with this, right?
Yeah, well, I think maybe I should write this book over again in 10 years and see where I come out. But it was hard to be empathic with Bello. He's a very difficult person. He did things that I disapproved of. And yet, as I say somewhere in this book, I wasn't his judge. I was his interpreter. And I think that's a big difference. So yes, I felt at times, and I go into this in great detail with my 12 Post-its that I put in the book, each acknowledging a flaw on that page where I'd been unfair to him. And then over the years, I started peeling away the Post-its. And so, like now, I still have that book on my shelf. There are only 6 left. And maybe next year I can, but I haven't taken one off in years. I think there's 6 unfair remarks in there, and that's all. There's nothing I can do about it. But yes, it was very painful to me. It was painful to him. It was painful all around. And yet, if I give myself a break now, I think the book was pretty accurate. I mean, I think that's who he was.
So after Bellows' death, you run into his son, Adam, and you express your doubts again about whether you had got Bellow correctly. And this reminds me, I did the same thing with Steve Bundy, the son of McGeorge Bundy. After Mac's death, I ran into Steve, and I expressed exactly the same doubts. And again, Steve, as Adam did for you, he said, no, you got him right. But this seems this convinces me again that, if you're a good biographer, you have to be not only empathetic, but compassionate, and you have to worry about what you've written. And so it's only going to be natural that you're going to have lingering worries after it's all done.
Yeah, it'd be better to have those worries before it's done so that you can protect yourself. Adam was very important in that regard because I really did trust him. And if I can digress for a second, he told me the funniest story that he went to a conference in Boston of psychiatrists, and there were three people there: Adam, and the daughter of Eric Erickson, and the daughter of Judge Blackmun. And they were all there to discuss what it was like to be the children of famous men. And Adam was having a complete meltdown before this event and hadn't prepared any remarks and was in a state of high anxiety. And finally got up on stage in front of these 1,000 psychiatrists in some Boston auditorium and said, "I'm glad my father's dead and fuck you." and I realized at that point, Adam is getting somewhere now. More of, what does the Spielvogel say? More of the same, please, or something. Now we may perhaps to begin. It's like, being a son of this guy was no fun. And they were shell-shocked by it. But if he said I got it right, then I must have got it right.
So turning for a moment to the memoir part of your book, you make it very clear how hard it is on your personal life, your financial standing. You at one point tell the story of you report that your mother-in-law, when asked what you did, described you as unemployed. And this resonated.
Was here.
Oh. Well, this story resonated with me because my wife never, or my mother-in-law, ever accused me of being unemployed. But my wife would constantly jump in and point out that she was the one with the real job, i.e. the one paying the rent. And, this biography has always been expensive, but, and it's a tough road financially. But has it gotten worse? Is it going to become impossible someday to?
I would say, just anecdotally, that yes, advances have gone down. I mean, there's no question about that. But the real issue is that these advances that seem so incredible if you're fortunate enough to get one for some kind of six figures, and then you kind of amortize it through the decade, your six figures shrinks alarmingly, and it's not a practical way to make a living. And unless you do presidents, I would urge anybody to follow the example of Ron Chernow. Just do presidents. But somebody in the New Republic the other day said I had affected the course of American literary biography. And I was pleased for about 3 seconds, and then I thought, what does that mean? Like, who knows what that is? How did I do that? What is the effect? What is the consequence? It's we're in a modest profession, and we do it because we love to do it. and I think it's worth it. In the end, I say this was a good way to spend my life, but it was not a practical way to spend my life.
But at one point, you were forced to get, quote, a real job.
I've had several real jobs. I've had real jobs, I've had fake jobs, I've had no jobs. My son is here, he knows all about it. So yes, it is not the road to riches. It's insanely labor intensive, it's sacrificial, and yet if you read, as I mentioned before, Claire Tomlin's biography, which is a book just marinated in tragedy and family deaths and catastrophe. It's one of the happiest lives I have ever read about. And on the last page, she says that when she goes to the opera and hears the beginning of, what is it, I guess Magic Flute, she just smiles and feels this kind of satisfaction. It's incredible. So my advice, no child of mine is becoming any biographer. But I'm not sorry I did it.
So you also report, you refer at one point to your wife, Annie, as a biographer's widow, the spouse of someone who is not strictly speaking dead, but not entirely present either. Now, that quote also resonated with me because my wife identifies also with this sentiment. We biographers seem to be space cadets, absent-minded, walking through life, obsessed with this other person, but not the people immediately in our family or lives. And we're kind of weird in that way, right?
Now, wait just a minute here. I certainly did my share, but it is true. When I was writing Delmore and Annie was in medical school and we were in our mid-20s, she would go off for 36 hours for her rotation, and I would sit there writing my book for the 36 hours. But when she came home, there was a third party with us. I made room for her. I certainly talked to her. But Delmore,
Delmore was always there.
Delmore, that line of his, the heavy bear who goes with me. So he was the heavy bear, and he went everywhere. And I think that's, there were also many years in my now long life when I was not writing biographies, and I'm sure I was better company at that point.
So, a different issue, you suggest, having written your first biography starting out when you were in your 20s, and then your second biography on Bellow, you signed, I think, when you were in your 40s, right?
Let's see, 1990, 50.
And from this experience, you suggest that a biography written by a 40-year-old a biography written by a 40-year-old will be more unforgiving, less sensitive to his subject's pain than a biography written by a 60-year-old. So the notion is that if you're in your 20s, you're going to be too harsh if you attempt a biography. And I thought about that, and it sort of made sense on one level, but it's not practical on another. I mean, you started out your first biography in your 20s, and you just confessed that you thought you got it right there.
Well, my great adventure with my first book, which I write about extensively here, was having Dwight MacDonald as my editor. He became obsessed with my book, and he was Delmore's executor. And you're of an age, some of you, where you might remember who Dwight MacDonald was. He was a fierce intellect and an amazing person who was capable of expressing great tenderness toward me and also being very abusive. And And he would write things in the margins like, "Ye gods, he's not a dime store ghoul," and that's kind of, and he wrapped the pages in gauze when he was in the hospital, and it was exhausting to deal with him, but it was so exhilarating because he was saying, "You're old enough," which I wasn't, to just take it, just whatever I have to say, whatever criticisms I have to offer, you'll somehow absorb. And he said, "Unlike the sundial, I record only the cloudy hours." So there was, once in a great while, he'd say, "Oh, here you get 4 stars, a la Mimi Sheraton," who was then the food critic of the New York Times. Then he would remove one of the stars with his red pen. So, so I guess, so this went on for 3 years. And by the end, I wrote a portrait of Dunmore that was quite sympathetic, but I wouldn't have done, if it hadn't been for Dwight, I would have been this smart-ass guy in his 20s.
You needed a 60-year-old at your elbow.
That's exactly what he was, and then I was always looking for the Dwight MacDonald for Bellow, and I finally found this frightening character named Edward Shills, who was a sociologist at the University of Chicago and is the model for Samler. And we were sitting in a little Chinese restaurant on Cermak Road in Chicago one night, and I had 400 pages. I said, would you, Professor, be willing to read my book? What I didn't say, because you're the most insulting, irascible person I've ever met, and you don't like Bellow, and you don't like me, and you don't like the waiter, and you don't like anything. And so he did, and he sort of did this work on the first half, and then alas, he died. So I had to go it alone. And as soon as page 400 is up, I start getting impatient. I needed another Edward Shills or Dwight MacDonald. But yeah, you have to, some people can do this themselves, but not me.
So you end the book on a really decidedly pessimistic note. You say that biography will survive, but not as we've known it. And I find that kind of disheartening. And then on a personal note, you go on to describe something I find absolutely shocking. You describe going through your apartment and collecting in a garbage bag articles and notes, and you're part of your personal archive, and then you throw it away.
I saved them too. Besides which, my mother, who's 100, has copies of everything, so don't worry about it. No, I did. It was a wrenching thing to do, and I have saved interesting documents, like this novel I describe. I didn't throw that out, that I wrote in my 20s. But the moment came when, what was the fate of these papers? I'd given my Dunmore papers to Yale and my Bellow papers to Chicago, and I still have kept a lot, but I felt suffocated by them. It was very hard to throw out my papers, and as I say, I kept a lot, but I felt that I was drowning in them. Like, move on, go forward. Don't sit around reading your girlfriend's letters from high school anymore.
Okay.
No, they're dead.
And the fate of biography?
And the fate of biography is also troubling, and I've struggled with that too, because what I did not want to do, and in my footnotes I often don't do, is write an elegy about it's over, we had our moment, this was the great era of biography, and we wrote our long 900-page books, and people read them, and now we're entering the age of technology. All of this is true, but I fought the feeling of, you say it's despair. I don't think that is the note that I meant to sound. I meant to sound
not despair.
Like, I'm
pessimistic.
Toast, well, yeah, I mean, yes, I am. It's over for me, sort of. But that doesn't mean that it's over. And the impulse to tell stories, to tell narratives, to write descriptions of people's lives, that will go on. It will be the same.
Well, I want to say to end this that this was inspiring to read this for me as a biographer. It really, it's a fantastic book. It's very personal, and it explains in a vivid, personal way the importance of biography. And so I think it's going to be used for many years to come to teach biographers how to acquire the passion, how to deal with their obsessive traits and as they go about the business of writing biography. So on that note, I want to open up the floor to questions.
Nick Hornby, the British novelist, when he wrote about Jonathan Coe's biography of B.S. Johnson, relatively unknown writer.
Of who, sorry?
B.S. Johnson. Okay, who got a 500-page biography. And so he wrote, let's use Peter Ackroyd's biography of Dickens as like a benchmark, 1,000 pages. Was B.S. Johnson half the writer or two-thirds the writer that Dickens was? If he wasn't, the book is too long. And you were talking about like what facts need to go into a book. Does the length of a book, is that ever a consideration in both when you're reading a biography or when you're writing your biographies? At what point is it too much and what's enough?
It's so variable because, look, you have Leon Edell's 5-volume biography of Henry James. I wouldn't miss a word. Or George Painter's 2-volume Proust. I mean, a book can be inordinately long and hold your attention because it needs to. On the other hand, I feel like this essay form of biography can be very useful in a biography like Macaulay's Boswell. I founded the Penguin Lives and invited writers, very famous writers, to write 150 pages about a subject who interested them, and they were tremendously enthusiastic about this. So many of them wanted to do it because they thought, oh, I'll write an essay instead of a biography, and it was very effective. So I don't think you can actually calibrate the words. I could name, but will not, a lot of long biographies that are just too fucking long. You don't want to read them. I read them, but they're boring. They're failures. So length can work against you, but I think you really have to have control over the material. And also another point is that I love biographies of obscure people, so that as I describe here, the biography that Carlyle wrote of this poet John Sterling, who really was utterly obscure and disappeared off the face of the earth. It's an incredible biography because Carlyle wrote it. And so I think that the definition of what is authorized or necessary is very elastic.
I'm not sure why I picked up your book, but once I got started, I couldn't put it down. It's a really humane piece of work. But what kept my attention over and over again, drew my attention, was that I'm not a biographer, I'm an ethnographer. And I've devoted the better part of 40 years to studying a small village on a small island in the South Pacific. But almost everything you said about trying to capture a life echoed my experience with trying to capture the life of a village and trying to separate out the difference between me and them and how much of what I write is who. And that intersected with the second theme that I kept encountering in your book, which is this fear of or sorrow about falling short of one's expectations. And as an ethnographer, the longer that I have worked on this, the less I feel I understand. And it wasn't clear to me how much of this sense of falling short that keeps popping up is in yourself and how much of it is in the task of biography. And I'd really like it if you could talk a little bit about that, because to me it just leapt out so powerfully.
That's just such a really interesting, essential question. I don't want to sit around arguing with my critics who aren't here anyway, but there's one critic said that I felt I had fallen short and was disappointed. I don't really feel that I've fallen short. I feel like I did the best that, as Philip Roth likes to quote Keith Hernandez or Joe Louis, I did the best I could with what I had. But I think falling short is an inevitable part of the whole process of study, of trying to learn about anyone. Henry James saying, never say you know the last word about any human heart. I mean, you fall short because it's in the very nature of things for you to fall short, not because you're flawed in some way and you weren't up to the job, but because the truth recedes from you as you advance towards it. And finally, over time, you learn to live with that, and you learn to feel that it's inevitable. It's built into the very structure of the process. So, yeah, I felt often that I knew less after. There's a story in here where Bello says, "So what have you learned?" I'm sitting in his kitchen after 11 years of this, and I said, "I learned you can't know anything about anyone." And he said, "Well, that's a good answer." But does that mean, what a waste of 11 years? No, it means I found out a few things, and the main thing I found out was the unknowability of people.
Could you ever imagine spending time with one person the way Robert Caro has with Lyndon Johnson?
Well, Robert Caro is a prodigious genius and has written a book that's not, it's sui generis. It's not like any book ever written. I could never do that. But Bob is, every day is a new day with him. He's on his journey. He's not hurried. And so he's a good example of the biography that can't be too long. He could just write it and write it and write it for as long as, which is what he'll do, as long as he will. It's just utterly gripping. But that's because he believes, unlike me, that you can know. Bob would dispute what I've just said. He would say, yes, you hang in there and you can figure it all out, and I'm going to do it. And he may.
You talk about the uncertain fate of biography. Well, what can we do to ensure that there will be some certainty ahead? And that I'm thinking of, how do we get young people interested in biography in this age of technology where kids don't really have the kind of concentration we had? So how can we lure them in so they'll read biography and hopefully write biography in this kind of illiterate age of ours, at least for the younger generation?
Yeah. I met on the way up here, I forget this gentleman's name who's writing on Eldridge Cleaver, but he looks young to me.
Justin Gifford.
Yeah.
He looks pretty young.
He looks pretty young. Yes, there's a young person. And then there were other people in my NYU biography seminar. Someone is writing on, he wrote on Lou Reed. I thought, this is fantastic. So, yeah, I think there are people for whom this will remain a form, and I don't think that the next generation will be just wandering the streets with their tape recorders. I mean, people will write biographies, but they have to find the people who inspire them, just as we were inspired.
As the youngest person in this room, can I answer that question?
Yeah, say what?
As a college professor who teaches undergraduates and graduate students, I'll say this: I think technology actually helps. Technology allows you to do research that you couldn't have done 10 years ago, even. When I wrote a dissertation, it was still very much a library-based kind of task, and now there's all sorts of digital archives and ancestry archives and various other kinds of things that are accessible online that allow for a very diverse kind of research approach that I think enables new kinds of biographies to be written. So for instance, with the Eldridge Cleaver biography, I've been able to trace his family lineage going all the way back into slavery and track down the people that bought his great-great-grandfather in 1838 in Alabama, which is something that even Cleaver didn't know anything about himself. So I think these new technologies actually are going to transform biography in ways that are very exciting, and I'm nothing but enthusiastic about the prospects
can say that there are no letters and no first edition, no first draft because of technology. It's a terrific loss for biographers. No letters and no first draft of technology.
Well, but we have emails.
Yeah, right. Well, it's different. I do feel sorry for the new generation of biographers who may have less of that incandescent experience of finding a letter in a library written in a smeared hand a century ago. I mean, that is kind of brings you right into direct contact with your subject in a kind of totemic way that no email could do. But as I say, what are you going to do about it? I mean,
Well, I'm sorry.
This is the way it is. I don't want to end on a on a nostalgic note. Like Bello said to me once, we were driving to some restaurant. He said, "I had no idea that our moment would be so brief." In other words, Jewish American writers' moment would be so brief. And I said, fortunately to myself, yeah, I mean, your moment is brief, but there are other people are going to their moments. And that's how I feel now. I may have had mine, but that doesn't mean it's over.
Well, I don't think I phrased my question very well. Really, what I meant, of course, technology and the digital advances are great, and being able to do research on an archives of it, at an archives while you're at your desk at home. But I was thinking, how can we get younger students interested in biography, so there are people also reading it, not just writing it. I mean, I've been to college classes where college students don't even know who Franklin Roosevelt is. So, how can we lure them into being curious, into reading them and reading biographies and engaging in the subject that we all love here?
Well, Pat, that's your job, right?
That's my job, yes.
You're going to make all that.
I'm going to make all that change. And Robert Dialog has a brand new biography out this month on Franklin Roosevelt. And it's only 800 pages.
Compared to Chernow, that's sure.
Jim, that was fascinating, but I have a practical question to ask you. I haven't read your book yet, but I plan to. I hope you'll sign it for me tonight before we go home. The question is this: how do you deal with dialogue? And I'll explain the reason I ask this. For my sins, I'm also embarked on a memoir, and there's quite a lot of family stuff in the early part, and I can, as it were, I can hear my mother and my father speaking. I can hear other members of the family, and I'm sure I can remember pieces of dialogue. But going back to your statement earlier that everything has to be true, I'm not at all sure that I heard it that way, and I'm also tempted, as a writer, to pretty it up. In other words, I think I make the dialogue that I do include sound probably a lot better than it was at the time. So do you deal with this at all, and how do you deal with it?
By the way, this is Michael Scammell here has written an extraordinary biography of Solzhenitsyn, among other works, so he's not an amateur. But when I wrote about Bello, I had a lot of dialogue, and it's pretty accurate, because every time I left him, I drove to the parking lot of Dairy Queen or down the street or somewhere and wrote everything he said to me. And I've done this with another famous writer I won't name, but it's like, it really works. But you can't practically do that. You can't run from your mother's table to go write everything down when you're 14 years old. I'm trying to write something now, and I don't have good notes, and I'm very unhappy with it. I mean, I don't think, I may not be able to do it. But I think you have to be the writer. You have to be someone who really listened. And I think people forget that biographers at their best are writers, that they are writing a book, a work of literature, and it's got to be reflected in the dialogue, in the description, in the characters, and even though it's not made up, I think you have to hold yourself to a high standard and work very hard, and where you can't remember.
But I'm sorry, I was really addressing myself to the memoir part of your book.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of it there is, but presumably when you were younger, you weren't running to the Dairy Queen writing down the dialogue.
Don't be so sure. 31 flavors it was, actually. But I don't quote that much, and so I quote my mother's memorable 10 sentences. I quote them. I'm sure they're accurate, but she doesn't go on at tremendous length. And also, I check things with her. One of my sources was a lady sitting next to her in a beauty shop in La Jolla, California, who happened to know Saul Bellow's wife's father, and described, talk about unemployment. She said, he never made a dime, that guy. But Bellow, but yeah, I think it's very hard to do, is the answer, discouraging as that may be, but you do the best you can.
I attended a meeting here on a biography of Franz Kafka, and I referred to his little book, Letter to His Father. And I said to the biographer that I know that Kafka gave it to the mother, who never gave it to the father. So he said to me, you are wrong, the father got the letter. I went to my source and I saw that Max Brod said that he never gave it. Now, who is telling, and this is a very significant part, whether the father got the letter or not. Who is right?
I wouldn't trust Max Brod, but I have no why. I don't remember I said before, you just know after a while. But yes, there are things. That's what I would say. But there are things that will never be resolved. It's just you have to. What does Keats say about negative capability? A willingness to entertain. I'm not going to get it right. Doubt. A willingness to not know, and I think that's, you become very humble as a biographer. It's like, this can't be known, and then you live with that.
So my question is, having spent all these years and trained yourself in being a biographer, what was the hardest thing in turning the spotlight on yourself?
The hardest thing.
The hardest thing in turning the spotlight on yourself and writing memoir.
Here in this book, I wanted to explain, this is not a memoir in the sense that it's not all about my parents, and it's not a memoir of my life except where it needs to be, here and there. But I wanted to explain who it was who wrote these books, why these books got written, what they mean to me, and to give some deep background into why a book turns out the way it does. It's not just something that you write and publish and then write the next book. I think people have no idea what a tremendous struggle it is on so many fronts to really just tell a story and be aware of the story you're telling and be aware of the person who's telling the story, namely you. And that was the hardest part. She said what?
She always celebrated her birthday on April the 10th.
Uh-huh.
So I said, oh, no, better get it off. Better get it. We just check it out. And she was actually born on March the 10th.
Aha, I know that. I know that type.
I know it's the true story and everything, but the actual date of your birth was March the 10th. And she thought for a moment. She thought, well, I never wanted to be a Pisces. I wanted to be an orange because they're more light-hearted in the game. She didn't like to be Pisces.
Now, see, I wouldn't have put that in the book because I have a violent opposition to what is it, astronomy or whatever it's called?
Astrology.
Astrology. Astronomy too, but See, that's an example, Sylvia, of somebody, of her taking control of, I mean, it's a good story, and you should have put it in, and you did. But I wouldn't have countenanced it. I would have just not paid attention. You know. As I said before, write about what interests you, kick around the facts.
But you would have gone with the document, not her memory.
Yeah, I would have
Her
gone
tale.
with both. I mean, I will refrain from going into the actual story of Bellows' birthday and why you don't know whether it's July 10th or June 10th, but it's something to hurry past very quickly. And yet it has a certain sociological interest.
My question is, do you think that writing a literary biography is different than writing other kinds of biographies about other figures, in that you have to consider the writing of the subject and integrate that to some degree into your narrative, like with Delmar Schwartz and Mello?
You mean writing, you have to write about the work. I mean,
You have to write about the works.
Which is a literary
Did
biography.
you find
from
that more complicated because that had to be integrated into your narrative along with the story of the life?
Yes, you could say that. It also gives you another source. It's like you have another witness who's brought forward. You have your subject, you have the subject's family and friends and enemies, and then you have the work, which is this voice, this powerful, dominating voice that illustrates a whole other aspect of his character. So it's part of what's exciting about writing literary biography, because then you turn to you turn to Herzog, or you turn to Samler or Augie March and hear what they have to say about all of this. And so, yeah, you integrate it, but you also keep it separate, because that's the creative part. And of course, literary biographers, are always making this mistake of saying, well, Herzog did this or Herzog did that, and therefore Bellow did. And in fact, that's usually the case, but not always. What's really interesting is not the facts in this instance, it's how he puts his experience into this other person's voice, this made-up person's voice. And that's what distinguishes a literary biography from a presidential biography.
Any other questions?
What did you discover when you wrote the book?
That's a question? What did I discover? What book and what? How?
What did you discover about yourself?
Oh, about myself?
That's
Well, it's on page 350. Just turn to that page, and well, you're the one who characterized us as so strange and weirdos and so on. I guess is that part of it? I discovered that I enjoyed writing about other people, because then I didn't have to write about myself.
well,
I've now gone and done.
that's true. We do choose to become biographers because we're interested in ourselves, and we discover ourselves by digging into the lives of other people often. And you do the same thing with memoir. And there's a difference, of course, and it's I guess there's a transference. But in my own career, when you decided not to do Edmund Wilson because you came to dislike him so much on a personal level, I've routinely chosen to spend years writing about people who I either thought initially were war criminals or people whose politics I disapproved of. But I found them fascinating, and the moving target that you refer to, I found that very true. I learned more about myself writing about McGeorge Bundy, a man whom I thought when I was in college, when he came to visit and gave a speech, was a war criminal because of Vietnam. I learned more about myself and my own anti-war position by writing his life story. And I had to, because I was the biographer, I had to try to see it from his eyes and write it in an empathetic fashion. But it's a very psychologically, it's filled with minefields, no?
Well, you're a very strange man.
Thank you.
You're a very lovely man. But yeah, we go down these roads, we don't know where we're going, where we're ending up, and I'd rather not know, but now I've gone and done it anyway. But you say you're writing a memoir now, right?
No, I wrote a childhood memoir that came out in 2010.
Oh, I must go.
About my childhood in the Middle East, growing up amongst the Arabs and Israelis and all the wars. And it was, it was much more difficult in a personal way because I had to talk about family and my parents' attitudes, and I was working from their correspondence, but I had to try to figure out what was going on around me as a child that I, couldn't possibly have known why these wars happened. So it was a lot of history, and weaving that back and forth. So it was a different kind of challenge than straight biography. But
That's fascinating. Actually,
now I'm doing Jimmy Carter.
yes, right. He is doing Jimmy Carter. I feel like asking you questions. Tell us about that.
Well, he's a president, and so I have some hope that maybe there'll be a market for this book, right?
That's
And
true.
because he's a president, there are, 2 million pages in his presidential library of formally classified documents. So I've got a wealth of material. And technology, as Justin was pointing out, is helping to manage that project because I can go in now with my cell phone and take pictures. And I have on this little cell phone, 17,000 pages of Jimmy Carter.
So nice.
I can file them in a digital way in different subject folders, just with the press of a button. It's quite amazing. Very different than when I started out in the 80s working in an archive and Xeroxing everything.
Right.
Right.
Putting those nickels in the machines. Well, good luck.
Anyway, I agree with you, Jim, though, that the biographer's life, though difficult and not very financially rewarding, is the only way to go if you're
It's the only way to
you
go.
are.
Don't miss it.